So I guess we've been doing this, at the beginning, a little bit of usually we just do silent. We were doing silent, like contemplating our motivation, but instead we've been thinking about that verse of refuge in bodhicitta. Um, because this text that we're studying, the Sublime Continuum, the Uttara Tantra, teaches on those topics, so it gives a lot to contemplate. We can just do that slowly together, right? So we say, the verse starts, I go for refuge. Actually, just that alone, we do the whole class. What's the I that goes for refuge? You just notice your own experience, right? When you say I, like I'm doing this, I'm doing that. What's your like? What is your actual experience of I? Where do you feel it in your body? In what way does the I exist? This text explains how, like, on the one hand, of course, you do exist, I do exist, but we often grasp at a I or a self. That's actually a mental projection. Right? That's actually a non-existent thing, like a hallucination. So there is an I that exists, but there's also an I we grasp at. And that's made up. So it's interesting, right? We say, I go for refuge to the Buddha. Actually, part of going refuge, for actually going for refuge to the Buddha, is eventually recognizing, right, the I that does exist and also the I that we grasp at that doesn't actually exist. And when we realize the difference between those two, then we've quite effectively taken refuge in the Buddha. By understanding the nature of ourselves, right? Mm. And so and then in the main presentation of this text, when we say I go fresh to the Buddha, you can think of some of the previous Buddhas who taught, but mainly we're here in this text. It means I go for refuge to my own future Buddhahood, to my in the future achieving the Dharmakaya, the mind of a Buddha, the truth body, meaning the mind of the Buddha. which completely fulfills my own welfare, right? There's a state of bliss and freedom, and also that fulfills the welfare of others because it engages compassionately with others. So that's what I'm really going for refuge to, right? Is that future attainment, and is the path that leads to that attainment of a different kind of mind, right? A different kind of way of being that arises from wisdom rather than ignorance, that arises from compassion rather than mental afflictions. I go for the Dharma. We know, right? There's the outer expression of the Dharma, but mainly here is I go for refuge to the realization of the nature of reality. And to the Sangha, right? Which externally is those who have realized that, or in the resultant refuge, like I emphasize in this text, it's my own future becoming a bodhisattva, Arya Bodhisattva, who's seen reality directly and who's realized bodhicitta. So I'm going for refuge to that kind of state because that state liberates me and benefits others. Through the practice of giving, right, and the other perfections. So those are the 6 perfections, right? The bodhisattva's practice, like giving, being ethical, being generous, say being ethical, being patient, joyfully making effort, meditative concentration, and wisdom. So those are like the way of life, right? Of one who's awakening, who's on the process of awakening. So I'll live in that way and even engage in this class that way, right? With concentration, with joyous effort. So may I become a Buddha to benefit all. So that path to Buddhahood is not something out there, right? It's just that. It's just practicing living in that way, which as best we can in each moment. And think like, so I'll just go through the verse one more time. Remind, you can kind of contemplate in those ways. That'll be our motivation. So I go for refuge until I'm enlightened. The Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha. The merits giving, generosity, and the other perfection. May I become Buddha to benefit all sentient beings. And then we'll return to the actual text, right, the Uttara Tantra. And so I'll just like reorient us. So it's New Year, right? So we finished the section on, this text has, they call 7 Vajra topics, right? So the first 3 are the Buddha jewel, the Dharma jewel, and the Sangha jewel, refuge. So we've covered those, and now we kind of just starting in on the section on, which is the longest section of this chapter, which is Buddha nature. We call it Buddha nature, or here they call it Tathagata essence. There are many different terms. Actually, and I said this before once, but actually that term Buddha nature is not really, it's an English term that people, obviously constructed, made up, but it's fine, but it's not wrong, but it's not really a good translation of any of the Sanskrit terms that they actually use, right? Like, so, I don't know quite what the history of what house, whoever made that up originally, but it became the popular term Buddha nature. But Tathagata essence, that's Tathagata Garbha. And even that word Garbha, it says essence, but it could be like womb, could be seed, right? So like you could say the womb of one thus gone, the seed of one thus gone, right? Tathagata is like thus gone, right? Gata, gata is as in the Heart Sutra, gata is gone, right? So one who has gone thus. And what is what gone thus even, by the way, right? It means like sometimes you say gone to thusness. It means gone to reality. One who's gone beyond illusion um, to fully realizing the nature of reality. So the essence, right, or the seed of, so that you have, the idea here is that you have the seed or the cause or seed, we'll call it, or essence. The term have different connotations, of becoming one thus gone to reality, right? So this text now is going to explain about that quite extensively, and I'll just mention. So first it says, first it gives a kind of introduction, I'll call it. Then we'll start the next part, which is 10. They call it 10 presentations here, but 10 presentations about it, and then 9 similes. So they do like simile, so there's similes to explain, and the similes are quite beautiful. It's a long section of the text that goes through these similes where that are trying to use images, right, to get at different aspects of what the Tathagata Garbha is. And because as we said at the beginning, right, Maitreya says in his text, it's, he's going to use words, right, but it's beyond words. And then he had that term, that's why they called it, right, remember, Vajra topics, we said, because on the one hand, Vajra means like hard to penetrate, right? So it's hard to put words to something that's beyond words. But they're also Vajra words in a way, in the sense that they're written by somebody, Maitreya, who realized his own Buddha nature. And so they also help us, they're sort of words from someone who's experienced that, helping others to then experience that who are interested. So we're going to kind of extensively look at these words that are getting at something beyond words. I guess my point though is that he gets at it from different angles, right? So these 10 presentations and 9 similes. He's coming at it from different angles to help us look at it from different perspectives in order to better understand what our Buddha nature is. Tathagata Garbha is. And we'll go through, there'll be different terms for it, but he starts off by saying something kind of a very short section here that's kind of interesting, where he says the causal phase, that explanation of the basic element of Tathagata essence. And then he says, so in this first part, he says the Tathagata essence briefly explained by 3 points. Actually, I'll just read this whole, it's just two little verses. So he says, because the activities of the Dharmakaya are pervasive, because suchness is undifferentiable, and because of having the lineage. Lineage is another term for, sometimes they use lineage as another term for Tathagata Garbha. So you might say, what do they call it? Sometimes that's translated as family or something, lineage, or something like that. Like it's like you're in the family, you're in the lineage in that sense, or the family of the Tathagatas. You're a child of the Tathagatas, we say, or bodhisattvas. They say when you generate bodhicitta, you become a child of the Buddhas. Says all sentient, so because of those 3 reasons, all sentient beings always have the Buddha essence. Then it says, because the exalted wisdom of Buddha abides in the multitudes of sentient beings. because the undefiled nature is non-dual, and because the Buddha essence is labeled Buddha, the name of its result, it is said that all living beings are endowed with the Buddha essence. So this first little tiny section there, it's making it, it's saying, what's it saying? First of all, it's saying you, yourself, and all sentient beings have this Buddha essence within you, right? This Tathagata essence, this Buddha essence within you. And then it's giving three reasons. Like it's sort of saying, and these are taught by Maitreya, but they all these points, by the way, these three, and then the 10 topic presentations, and the 9 similes, they're taught by Maitreya. But if you look in the commentaries, they are found also in Buddhist sutras. So Maitreya took them from sutras and sort of put them in a certain order and explained them in more detail, because the sutras are a little, it's hard to understand in and of themselves. So he kind of took the main points and explained them. So here, these 3 points come from sutras too, but so those 3, right? The first one is because the activities of the Dharmakaya are pervasive. So what's that saying? So in his commentary, Gyaltsab says, first I'll read it. The Dharmakaya activities of the perfectly enlightened Buddha, who himself has attained the fruition by realizing the path that purifies the element, his Tathagata Garbha, radiate and pervade all sentient beings. And so what this first point is getting at is a few things here. What it's saying, so he's saying, Maitreya is saying, you and all beings have Buddha nature. And then he's saying, why do I assert that? You can say, he might say, why am I saying that? And then he says, so one point is, the previous Buddhas achieved the Dharmakaya, right? Achieved the mind of a Buddha. That's what it means to become a Buddha, right? And he's saying their Dharmakaya, using his actual phrasing here, says, are pervasive. Right? So that means, it's interesting, right? Like the Dharmakaya of the Buddha is right here. That's what it's getting at. It pervades all sentient beings. So the Dharmakaya, the compassionate, omniscient mind of a Buddha, pervades all sentient beings, including you, right? And Kensho Rinpoche, when he kind of explains, when he said, so all beings are susceptible to the influence, to some extent, of the Buddhas. And if you're susceptible to that influence to some extent, then over a long enough period of time, you can progress, right? Some people progress more quickly, some will progress less quickly, but it's possible. And one point, my Kensho Rinpoche, when he explained this point, he said, another point he made was, he said, also there are no beings who are completely devoid of good qualities. Even the worst beings have moments, or have certain contexts. And then so there's various points here. One is, so there's a receptivity, there's a relationality between ordinary sentient beings and the Buddhas. And the Buddha's compassionate activity engages with all sentient beings, is the nature of Buddha's activity, right? There are various things we can do to block out being receptive. But nobody's intrinsic, you can say it this way, nobody's intrinsically unreceptive, right? Like, and it's like, in the Lamrim, I should use a metaphor for a second. This is not literally what it's saying here, but in the stages of the path teachings, they make a point. They say, they use this analogy where they say, actually, they're saying how to listen to the teachings. So they're saying there are faults of a cup. We've studied the Lamrim texts, right? And they say, like, so what they're getting at, though, is like, I'll give an example. Like if it's raining and you want to collect water, right? Like, so the metaphor here would be the Dharma is like the rain coming down, right? That if the cup's upside down, it's not going to collect much water. Right? There are 3. If the cup has a leak, if somebody broke a hole through the bottom of the cup, well, the water will go in, but it'll flow out. And then if the cup has poison in it, it won't. You can collect the water, but you can't drink it. And So that teaching in the Lamrim gets to the point that, there are ways we can, if you're an upside down cup, no matter how much water is pouring down, it's not going to fill the cup. But I'm making a point, which is using that example from the Lamrim teachings, the stages of path teachings, that the Buddhas still reign on you, so to speak. They still offer the Dharma. Is what this is getting at. Their activity pervades, and so eventually, if you think of an upside down cup that gets tipped halfway and then a little bit starts to get in or something like that, the Buddhas won't stop, is part of the point. They won't stop trying to benefit you. So if you ever are in the right receptive moment, then you'll receive what you can receive. Yeah.
So the use of the word pervasive is this pervasiveness of Buddha's activity, does that counteract the pervasive suffering?
If you're open to it, yeah, eventually
Okay.
it does. It doesn't counteract it in the moment for the person who's not yet open,
Right.
but eventually it does. It does.
Okay. So the use of pervasive in both cases means that it's.
In this, I guess it's slightly different. Pervasive suffering in the three kinds of suffering that you're getting at,
Yeah.
means that what that's getting at is that everywhere in samsara, even at the highest pleasure of samsara, you have this pervasive suffering of being under the control, that you're not in control of your own mind, actually, really, and therefore karma. Because you're under the influence. The pervasive suffering means you haven't yet gained freedom from ignorance, and therefore your rebirths are thrown by karma and ignorance.
Okay.
That's what that one means. So, but in that sense, all beings in samsara are pervaded by a kind of existential suffering, I call it,
Right.
of not being in control of your own process of death and rebirth. Here, what it means pervasive, when they say pervasive, what they mean is that the Buddha's Dharmakaya awareness, you could say, it pervades all sentient beings, that the Buddha is aware of you and all beings, and that their activities of compassion are directed pervasively at all beings, including yourself. So it's a slightly different connotation.
Okay. Thank you.
So that's the meaning of the first line, right? Where it says the Buddha's activity, because the activities of the Dharmakaya are pervasive. That's the first reason why all beings have Buddha nature that Maitreya is mentioning. Then he gives a second reason. He says, because suchness is undifferentiable. So suchness is a term, right? It's a synonym for emptiness, right? Suchness is another term to get at emptiness. So commentary says, the Buddha proclaims that all sentient beings are endowed with the Tathagata Garbha, thinking or meaning that they all have reality that is naturally isolated from the mental contaminants or the mental afflictions in their continua. That means their mind is, the ultimate nature of all beings' mind is emptiness, right? Is empty of intrinsic existence. And they sometimes call that, right? There's a phrase they use for another term, right, for Tathagata Garbha, which is ultimate truth mingled with taints, right? Meaning it's an emptiness, but it's the Tathagata's mind is a ultimate truth unmingled with taints. Right? Ordinary sentient beings' minds are ultimate truth that is mingled with taints, in the sense that we still have mental afflictions. And a point, though, that is just to explain this one a little more, that teacher emphasized, Khenpo Rinpoche mentioned when he talked about this, he said, I mentioned this earlier, that we have to differentiate the conventional truth. I got your email about the two radios, about ultimate and conventional truth. That was very good. Two radio stations. It's a good metaphor. Was Guy Newland? Yeah. So we have to differentiate the conventional truth from the ultimate truth in this discussion. Because one point that the Khenpo Rinpoche was making when he taught on this is, he said, from a conventional truth perspective, we can say the ordinary sentient being's mind is mingled with, their ultimate nature of their mind is empty, but conventionally their mind is mixed with taints. They have anger, they have jealousy, they have pride, they have craving, and so on. And a Tathagata, from a conventional perspective, you can look at them and say, well, their mind is unmixed with taints. They've had cessation of all the mental afflictions, so they don't have that. So from a conventional perspective, that's a valid assertion. But what Ken Shimizu is pointing out is when you look at the ultimate nature of mind directly, all that appears is the emptiness. And that emptiness, whether it's of your mind or of a Buddha's mind, are undifferentiable, right? That's what this term undifferentiable, because it's the same nature. It's of one taste. They're both equally emptiness, right? They're equally a non-affirming negation of intrinsic self-existence. And so from the ultimate truth perspective, undifferential means you can't tell the difference. There's no difference from that perspective, right? So if somebody were to realize the ultimate nature of their own mind, right? If they're not yet a Buddha, when they come out of that meditative equipoise, they could say, oh, well, I still have the taints of afflictions. That would be true, But when they're in that experience, there's no difference, you can't differentiate, right? They're both emptiness, equally and undifferentiably. Like they say, like water poured into water is sometimes a description of the experience. And so from that perspective, when you're in that state, you can't differentiate, oh, this is the Buddha's emptiness and this is the sentient being's emptiness. They're of the same nature. Does that make sense? And so that's another reason why all beings have Buddha nature, is that you already have, right? That ultimate nature of your mind is undifferentiable from the ultimate nature of the Buddha's mind. And you already have that within you. So you have Buddha nature. There's a second reasoning that Maitreya is presenting. And then the third reason, he says, because of having the lineage, right? And then later he explains that further. He says, because Buddha essence is labeled Buddha as the name of its result, it is said that all living beings are endowed with it. So this gets at this term lineage, right? Which oh yeah, the Sanskrit term for that is gotra, and the Tibetan is rig. And so this word rig in Tibetan, sometimes they translate it as lineage or family, or Art Engel, a friend who's a translator, said sometimes that's also can be translated as embryo, like lineage in the sense of like a child, And so what this is getting at is that, first of all, it's making a few points here. One is all beings have this kind of spiritual potential for Buddhahood. And if you want to kind of contemplate that more, one point that's made sometimes is there are two meanings of lineage, actually, or two ways of thinking about it. There's I've mentioned this once before, there's a naturally abiding lineage and the developing lineage. So the naturally abiding lineage abides as the nature of your mind, and abides there is always there, it pervades the mind, and that's its emptiness, its ultimate nature, which is emptiness, which we've been talking about. So one point is that naturally abiding lineage is the nature, the ultimate nature of your mind. It's always there, and that's your Tathagata Garbha, right? And then the naturally abiding lineage is the source of, is what allows for the developing lineage. And the developing lineage is connected to what I mentioned earlier, that all beings have certain, at least capacity for certain good qualities, or for various good qualities, which can be increased if they make effort. And so that's called the developing lineage, in the sense that it's something that can be developed, right? That you can develop. And if your mind weren't, part of the point here is that if your mind's nature weren't empty, then it would be static, right? It would be something that's intrinsically as it is, right? It would be unchangeable. So if you were angry, then your mind would always be angry, right? But actually, so one of the proofs of this is like, even a very angry person isn't always angry, right? Like sometimes they're too busy being craving for something to be angry. So I can't, it's like I'm too busy desiring. I can't worry about anger right now. There is no mental affliction that's continuous. That makes sense, right? They're because we give rise to various mental afflictions, and occasionally we give rise to virtuous minds, like love, every now and then. So you can say, but the fact that we occasionally give rise to, say, love, means that we can give rise to more love, and the fact that we can let go of anger in one moment means we can cultivate patience. And so, because that's what I'm getting. Because there is the naturally abiding lineage, in other words, because the mind is its ultimate nature is emptiness. Therefore, we have the developing lineage, which is these good qualities of the mind. So let's mention this in the Vartika, so the treatise on valid cognition by Dharmakirti. He makes a really interesting point about this, connected to this point, which is he says, physically, you can develop certain strength, right, or qualities like strength in your speed or jumping, the ability to jump. He gives that analogy. He says, and if you train yourself in jumping, like Olympic athletes do, you can get higher, you can jump higher or longer. But he makes a point, he says, but because of the nature of the physical world, there are limitations. You can only, like, even if you train your whole life like an Olympic athlete, there's only so high, like there's a world record, maybe somebody breaks the world record, but there's a limitation, and there is this nature of human bodies that you can't jump more than a certain distance, right? And a different kind of body maybe can jump further, but not, like certain animals can jump further than humans, but there's a limit for that animal and how far it can jump. And then he says, but the mind doesn't have such limitations. It's not the nature of mind to have such limitations. So mental qualities, when you develop them, can be developed limitlessly. And he makes that point. He says, and whether it's bad qualities or good qualities, that's possible, right? So in other words, if somebody were to cultivate hatred, which happens, unfortunately, it's possible to develop a kind of infinite hatred, right, where you hate everybody, including yourself, if you let yourself do that. Fortunately, the same goes for love. The same goes for compassion. Like there's not some intrinsic limitation in the mind. So in other words, you can cultivate a mind that loves one person or two people. You can cultivate a mind that just loves your family or your tribe or your group. Then you can cultivate a mind that loves your group and a couple of other groups. But you can keep going, and you can eventually cultivate a mind that loves everyone, every being. You can cultivate a mind that pervades everywhere with love, and every space with love, and every being with love, and there's no limit. And he says something similar. He says if you notice that about your mind, then that gives you confidence that you can become a Buddha. When you notice that truth of your mind. He says, so check it out. Basically, just kind of check out. You try it out and see. I remember when I first thought about that, I was like, well, I could see it because when thinking of my own experiences, I look around, I was like, oh, I can see the negative examples of that quite easily, right? Like there are people who, because of certain circumstances, right, you are in a certain circumstance, and somebody who is relatively patient starts becoming angry and becomes angrier and angrier and angrier until they're like, so it's like, oh wow, that is possible, isn't it? That somebody who wasn't very angry could become incredibly angry, or somebody who started, you look at somebody who started off, maybe not overly desirous, and then becomes like, say, an addict or something like that, and becomes completely overwhelmed. So it's like, oh wow, yeah, the wrong circumstances really can give rise to like such humongous changes in mind. And then if you try, of course, the Dharma practice, then the opposite, right? The good, you can cultivate kind of incredibly powerful compassion or love or wisdom or patience and so on. And so that's what this is getting at here, is that's possible. Ultimately, it's possible because the ultimate nature of mind is emptiness. But then if you check, you have this developing lineage where you can develop qualities. And they made one more point here, which is the basis, which is the naturally abiding lineage, right? The ultimate empty nature of mind. When put through the influence of a path whose nature is wisdom, becomes the Dharmakaya of Buddha, the mind of a Buddha. The developing lineage, right, that second kind of Buddha nature, when it goes through a path whose main emphasis is method, which means creating compassion, love, and merit, good karma, right? Which good karma just means virtue means actions done with out of love or compassion, or those other kind of states, gives rise to the bodies of the form bodies. So the Rupakaya, the physical bodies of the Buddha. So there's a process, and you need both is part of the point here, that just having the naturally abiding lineage only is the basis that gives rise to the eventual result of the Buddha's mind. But it's also, we have to, part of the Buddha Bodhisattva practices are things like generosity and ethics, which are physical behaviors motivated by compassion, and mainly, and so those activities are necessary and give rise to the form bodies of a Buddha. So that's all required in the process. So that's just this little, explain this little beginning point where he says, so he's making a point though, why is he teaching all that? I just want to say this because I think it's quite important, is these are to be contemplated, right? Because sometimes you may feel, I can't become that, right? Like it's so far off, you could feel discouraged. And then that's the point. So you would think of these points, right? In order to, what's the word? Recognize you yourself can become a Buddha. And I'm going to share that. I remember once I was meditating, I was contemplating a lot and trying to think of bodhicitta, the teachings on bodhicitta, the wish to become enlightened. And there was in that phase, I was going, well, I was very strongly able to relate to compassion. I was like, oh, that makes sense. That's like best, it's like quite. But the idea of becoming enlightened seemed a little, it's like, I realized I had this idea like, oh, well, somebody else can become enlightened, but it was like hard to imagine that was possible for me. I was like, intellectually, maybe that sort of makes sense, but I wasn't feeling that. And so that's part of the purpose of this, so if you're stuck in that way, then you go to these teachings on the Tathagata essence, right? To go, okay, I have to contemplate it. Is this true of me? Or am I some kind of an exception? Is my mind not ultimately empty of intrinsic existence? And if even, they say even Shanti David is, I think, this is it. Even animals have Buddha nature, right? Even dogs and bugs, even a bug has Buddha nature. The thing you say, do I not? You have to check, right? And contemplate on it and say, well, do I have absolutely, if I have some good qualities, can they be increased? And you say, well, yeah, they can be increased a little for sure, right? And because I can see that, I can I have a little bit of this, and I can, I remember once I was thinking, I was like, oh wow, I caught myself actually, I remember when I first moved to this area many years ago, I was worried about getting a job, and I wanted this. I was like, sort of, I caught myself it was a job. I went on a job interview that I didn't get, and I realized I'd sort of exaggerated one quality of my experience. And I was like, oh, I was glad I didn't get that job. And I thought, I'm not going to do that anymore. I didn't lie. But it was kind of a small lie. Oh yeah, I know how to do that. That kind of, oh yeah, I have some experience with that. I kind of said something like that. And afterwards I was like, oh, that's not quite true. I don't have as much experience as I kind of implied, maybe. But, and I thought, I've got to stop that. That's not right. So then the next job interview I went to, I was very honest and straightforward. I got that job, and very good. I said, no, I don't know. I'm not really good at that. But I'm good at this. This is what I like to do, and if I'm willing to learn or something. It's like, oh, okay, great. Got the job. It was much better. Point is so I was like, okay, I can do that. I can be more straightforward. I can be more honest. So if you can be more honest, then eventually you can become a Buddha. That's my point, right? You can change. The mind's natures can become better. That's my point. I'm just using a silly example, but true. So we contemplate these points, right? And that the Buddha's activities pervade you. And can you, and again, it's amazing, isn't it? That's what they're saying. The Buddha's activities pervade all beings, which means they pervade you, which means the Buddha's, what's the word? Is influencing you, wants to influence you. I made this point last time also, that an implication of that, of course, is that, that doesn't only apply to Buddhists, right? And that the word Buddha is just a Sanskrit term, right? It's not, because I'm not saying this to say, oh, everybody secretly is, controlled by the Buddha. That's not right. It's that compassionate activity, right? That's the nature of that compassionate activity. I think it's not saying everybody should be Buddhist. It's just saying the Buddhists want to help everybody. it's like with the Dalai Lama when he goes around saying, like, if there's something useful in Buddhism, take it. Don't become Buddhist. Don't care, right? And then he says, and then he makes that point. He says, because I'm learning from other traditions, right? He gave the example of like some traditions that were building hospitals. He said, we haven't been so good at that. Let's get better at it. So those are good examples, and so it's not that point isn't everybody become Buddhist, but is that everybody has capacity for goodness, right? And the Buddha's activities are trying to encourage that goodness in all beings. Any questions about that before I go on to the 10 presentations? Yep.
So is it all of the Buddha's Dharmakaya that is all pervasive? Or is there any kind of like a universal Dharmakaya that maybe, not limited to all of those Buddhas, individuals who became Buddhists and then generated the Dharmakaya? I don't know if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, I've thought that same question and asked it. Like, it's an interesting question, right? Is the Dharmakaya, and because in one sense, right, like, what would it mean? It's an interesting question, right? I think that you're getting at. Could you have people focus on Zoom here? Question. Okay, because he was asking, like, is the Dharmakaya one universal sort of phenomena, or are there individual Dharmakayas? Is that kind of what you're getting at? Of each Buddha, does each Buddha have their own Dharmakaya or something? And I actually, my reading and my understanding, at least, of like the texts, I guess, the Tibetan traditions sort of debates or something, is actually different teachers have taken slightly different positions on that question. So it's like it's been a point that's been actually debated and discussed, sort of interestingly, sort of what's the nature of Buddha's mind. So that's one point. Another point is, of course, I don't know because I'm not Buddha, but my own sort of take, at least from having read those things and then sort of thought about them some, is that in terms of say a few things, right? There's this Svabhavakaya Dharmakaya, which is the emptiness of the Buddha's mind. Now that you'd have to say it'd be silly, right? I mean, because it's a mere non-affirming negation, so to say, this emptiness is different than that emptiness would be kind of silly. So from that so for one point is if you think of it in terms of the Svabhavakaya Dharmakaya, they're all mere emptiness. So it's not to say they're differentiable would be kind of silly from their own perspective. That's one point. But then there's the functional, right, the omniscient aspect and the compassionate aspect of Dharmakaya that are not mere emptinesses, but are also conventionally, sort of conventionally functioning phenomena. And the way I mean, so again, I think different Buddhist philosophers say different things. The way I personally think about that is that on the one hand, the way I think of it is this: is that I think of them as some texts I think agree with, but the way I think of them is they're of, you say one entity, but different isolates in the Buddhist philosophical terms. Good. Yeah.
Would you?
Oh
No! Oh, I'm sorry.
Oh, Paul, you had it first.
Well, you kind of think of it as one essence, but everyone's got their own. In that, for instance, everything in the universe, in our universe, is made up of hydrogen atoms, but we're all different. So we each have our own, but we all got the same thing, kind of. But how you use it is up to you, and differentiated by time and place, all that good stuff.
I was just thinking that you express the epiform relationship to emptiness and dependent arising. That you without dependent arising, there is no emptiness. Without emptiness, there's no dependent arising. So I think of it as kind of like an infinity sign. Like that, they're conjoined. They each have their own spheres of influence, but they're conjoined. Does that make sense?
Yeah. You got it. Well, I'll just make a quick comment, like, further about this, wait, is that, in terms of the, yeah, the Dharmakaya, like, it's similar, I think, to what you were saying, Paul, I think, but I guess I would say, there, how'd you put one essence, I think you said it, or one entity, I was saying, but is that
All
what,
the above, yeah.
I can't remember which word you used, but, you know, like, in the sense of, you know, that which is omniscient can't, you know, is omniscient, right? Like, but there's a usefulness, I think, in viewing them from a conventional perspective as how, you know, I'll give an example. Like, I'm going to give a practical example. Like, they say that Amitabha Buddha, right, and Amitayas Buddha are the same. Like, there is this the Sambhogakaya and Nirmanakaya aspect of the same being, is what they say. But if you practice, but from a practice perspective, if one practices, you know, like people often practice Amitayas Buddha for long life, and people often practice Amitabha Buddha for various practices, but particularly to go to Amitabha's Pure Land is an often common practice. So they kind of have different functions from the perspective of a practitioner, you know, and oftentimes it's kind of funny. I think Tibetans are quite good at playing with this issue. Actually, you know, people say, "Oh, so and so is the incarnation of this person and that person," and or you know, Amitabha manifested as this being and that being, you know, or like, or Avalokiteshvara is manifest as this being and that being, and so on. And I think what actually is being gotten at, to some extent, is, you know, in the end, they all have the same. You know, you can in the end you can't differentiate their Dharmakaya ultimately, but there is a usefulness relationally, you know, and I'm just going to get a conventional point that for me helps me think about it. It's just how I think about it oftentimes. Is like it's really weird, isn't it? Like I was thinking of this, like I can think of, for example, some of the greatest Buddhist masters I've ever met, or who lived in our time. Who, and I'm going to give you an example. And then, like, I think of like there's a community where my mom lives, where she guides. She's very she's likes Buddhism. Hasn't studied a ton, but is very fond of it, and leads a little meditation group for other women around her age. And you know, if you invited the greatest living master of Tibet to that place, they wouldn't come, and they wouldn't know what the heck he's talking about. But if she guides the meditation, they love it. You know, it's like, oh, great, let's go to the pool and we'll all meditate. You know, she lives in Florida. And they're thrilled and they love it. And they say, would you please, you know, whatever, my child is sick and can we all gather to do a medicine Buddha? You did this thing, medicine Buddha, one time, and can we do that again? And she'll say, sure, let's do that. Great. You know, and I'm so happy to get to do that. I love my neighbors and I want to help them. You know, and they're not Buddhists, but they love to gather and meditate. So there's some unique karmic relationship, you know, that, and so that's part of, I guess, what I'm getting at is that, like, there are these karmic relationships where, so there's a usefulness in differentiating in that sense, right? That, you know, is on the one hand, all the Buddha's Dharmakayas are one entity or one essence or one, but relationally, there's an important point, which is, you know, and I can see that for myself also, right? Like there are certain like people who like say, oh, I study with this master and they're so great and they're, you know, this great Buddhist. And then I'm like, oh, I just, I'm not critical, but I just don't, they don't seem like anything to me. I don't know, it just seemed like somebody. And then somebody else, you feel incredibly moved, right? When they, and so there's a relationship that's important. So it is important to differentiate them from the perspective of practitioner.
The Dharmakaya can be conceptualized as like the undifferentiated aspect of reality. Then wouldn't like wouldn't stepping into relation necessarily be maybe Sambhogakaya or something else? Not, I mean, by necessity, Dharmakaya would be undifferentiated, would it not be?
Yeah, so at one point you were getting like how do you say it the right way? one way they say it is that the Buddha, when the Buddha realizes their Dharmakaya, or the Buddha realizes the Dharmakaya, right? The Buddha is also aware that only another Buddha can perceive the Dharmakaya. Nobody else can perceive the Dharmakaya directly. And so then the Buddha, because of their vow of compassion, essentially, right, has to manifest the Sambhogakaya and the Nirmanakaya aspects in order to allow beings to and in a way that's what this text is, right, where he says this at the beginning. I've mentioned it, he says these are difficult points to understand. You know, he's teaching about Dharmakaya, and he's saying these are difficult because they're not the experience of ordinary people, because they're not accessible to ordinary people. And then he says, but I'm going to use words, you know, to help people develop a relationship to that, so that they can then realize it in their own experience. So yeah, again, you can't directly access the Dharmakaya itself, so you have to. So the Buddha manifests, for example, a Nirmanakaya that then speaks words and then records those words.
Their words that
English being what it is, when you use the word the Dharmakaya, that implies one Dharmakaya. Whereas it would seem to me that you should, or a person should be saying his or her, that the Buddha sees its own Dharmakaya rather than you can see mine, your ours, whatever. We each have our own.
What's interesting is
They're
that
all-
in that sense, oh, good.
They're all the same, they're all unique.
Well, and if the Buddha's omniscient, they know all the, because the Buddha's omniscient, so they know all. So you could say the Buddha knows all the Dharmakayas then too.
Sure.
So the Buddha would know the other Buddhist Dharmakaya. It's kind of fun. Seems funny.
But for what it's useful, it's more useful to know ours who need the help.
Yeah.
I guess.
Another.
I'm curious, does the Tibetan or Sanskrit actually use like the plural form of Dharmakaya?
Oh, interesting. I think they do have a term. Yeah, I think I've seen it in Sanskrit.
Dharmakaya.
I think it might be Dharmakayam or something like that. I'm not sure exactly though. I don't know Sanskrit very well, but I think there is a plural though.
So, because it's kind of funny that this came up because I was formulating a question, but so I guess to make sure I understand, because you were saying about how they manifest, even though they kind of have a very similar. So, like for example, with the medicine Buddha always being blue in pictures. So is the idea that it's not that something about the medicine Buddha is inherently blue, but that from like our side is hopeful to have that symbol, and so it's like they do it that way to make us understand better, and that's why they all have the same, very similar, like the hand gestures and colors and things. So that's sort of like for our benefit, but it's not necessarily their intrinsic appearance. Is that?
Yeah, that's exactly right. Yeah, so the form, like, what do you, I don't, could you hear that? By the way, I can't keep realizing that. Could you check? Could people online hear the questions? Yeah, okay, good. But yeah, no, that's exactly right. So they manifest, and actually, there's an interesting points they make sometimes about that, which is like it's kind of I sometimes find almost funny. Like, I'll give an example, like of the 21 Taras as an example, right? It's famous, you know, they're like all Tibetans recite. There's a taka right here about the 21 Taras, and all the Tibetan traditions recite the praises to the 21 Taras. There's an actual tantra of the Tara Tantra that has those, you know, things. But actually, if you start to really study the 21 Tara, and picking them as an example, there are different versions of the 21 Taras. Like, so this one, there are different colors, but they're all having the same posture in this taka, and they all are not holding anything. There's another one where in the right hand they hold a vase. There's another one where on their lotuses they have different symbols to symbolize their activities, and so on. And the point I'm making is just, you know, like it's not. They would say it's not that one of them is wrong and the others are right. You know, it's that different yogis or yoginis, when they achieved a certain level of the path, would have a vision of 21 Taras. 21 Tara would appear to them. And sometimes she'd appear holding something, sometimes she wouldn't be. And so they would, you know, draw a picture of that or write it down and say, this is how Tara appeared to me. And part of what they're getting at in a way is what you're getting at, which is like, there was a purpose, like, I don't know, maybe people needed that symbol for her to be holding it, we're going to do that particular practice at that time because they could relate somehow more to that activity. And even the medicine Buddha, like usually he's blue, but I think there's a version, I think I've seen, might be a version where I'm not sure, there was a different color. So there are certain times where like, but the idea is, yeah, that there are certain like that those colors are connected to something in us is the idea, and that there's nothing intrinsically blue or white or green or whatever about a Buddha. The Buddha manifests in a color that sort of expresses something for the disciple is the idea, for students or practitioners. All right, so then we can start on the 10 presentations. So it says 10 presentations, establishing the basic element, another right term for Buddha nature or whatever. So establishing the basic element to be pure by nature by way of 10 presentations. And so I'll read the list, I guess, and then we'll start the first of them. So nature, so these are the 10: nature, cause, result, function, possession, manifestation, state and similarity, the meaning of all pervasiveness, immutability, and indivisible qualities are said to be the intended meaning of the ultimate basic element. So here, right, what's going on, right, is that Maitreya is going to present 10 points that are said to be the intended meaning. So right, there's this term, ultimate basic element, or Tathagata Garbha, or Buddha nature, or all these different, right, there are synonyms, but he's saying, here are 10 points to kind of explain, because that's just a term, right? Here are 10 points to kind of get at what is that, right? What is its nature? What are the causes that influence it? What is the result that it leads to? What's its function? And by understanding those aspects of Buddha nature, you'll better understand it, right? So he's going to say, I'm going to explain 10 things about Buddha nature, and by understanding these 10 things about it, you'll understand it better, because it has a nature, it has a function. And these are ways of understanding anything, right? Like if you were to say, what's the nature of a car is different than its function. What's the function of a car, right? What's the cause? What are the causes of a car? You could explain a phenomenon in this way, right? Like what causes it? What does it do? What is its results? And so on. So he's going to do some of that. We'll start and see how we want to go. So we'll start with the first point, which is nature, right? And here it says he's going to explain nature and cause together, but we'll go through for nature first. So he said, what does he say about so? And different translators, somebody said nature or essence, and somebody translated that same term as essence. So what's the nature or what's the essence of the Tathagata? He says its nature is always unafflicted, like the purity of a jewel, space, and water. And then he further explains a bit below where it says the meaning of nature. And it says, because of having power, being unchangeable, and by nature moistened with compassion, it resembles the qualities of a precious jewel, space, and water. So one important point here is it says its nature is always unafflicted, right? That's the first line. So part of what's being gotten at here is that the nature of the Tathagata Garbha is that it's, she says, what, unafflicted or unstained, right? And this is an important point. So it's getting at, we ourselves, right, as people, have mental afflictions, and we make mistakes, and we do things that are mistaken. But within us, right, within is kind of funny, but it's fair. using language, right? So within us is this the Tathagarbha, which is pure by nature. That's what it's saying, right? Which is unafflicted, or is unstained, or is pure. And so he's using three metaphors here, or three similes, I guess, he says like. So there's a couple, I'm going to explain in a minute what those three refer to, but first I want to make a general point. Over and over again, you're going to see this, and especially in the similes that come later, a lot of these examples of this, but they'll often say, so the jewel, right? The first one is a jewel. And what they're going to, the metaphor here is, if you have a precious gem, a diamond, let's say, and it's dropped in the mud, right? It's completely immersed in the mud, like under the, it like sunk into the mud, right? It's not any less a diamond because it's in the mud, right? Or if it's a ruby, same thing, right? So if it's under the mud, or it's under the dirt, or it falls in a dustbin and it's totally covered with the dust, it's no less a diamond than if it weren't. But in that moment, you can't see it, right? And then space, the metaphor they often use for that one is like the sky, right? Whereas on a crystal clear day, if you go outside, it like the sky has this like very sort of clear, brilliant, open appearance. Whereas on a very cloudy day, it doesn't look that way. But they make the point, the clouds don't change the nature of space, right? Like in other words, the space hasn't changed. It's not like a space is permanently changed. It's temporarily kind of obscured by clouds, but the clouds can't permanently change the nature of space. And the same thing with water, right? They often use this point. They'll say, if you have like very clear, like if you have very clear water, and then it's in a pond, and then you stir up the mud from the bottom, then that water will appear very murky, right? But the murkiness, the dirt from the bottom doesn't change the nature of water, right? Like it settles eventually, and then the water is still water, and they're separable, right? And this is getting at, it's trying to help us get at something, right? Which is, that our Dharmakaya, or not our Dharmakaya, sorry, our Tathagarbha is like well, I'll use the water one, is like water in that sense, right? It can be mixed with all kinds of stirred up stuff, but it's separable from them. And those things never change its nature. Does that make sense? No matter what it gets mixed with, it's still water. And in the end, it can be what we call distilled, right? Purified water. Like, you can actually, right, people that carry those things, like if they go camping, right? But you can pour the water and it takes out the contaminants, right? My metaphor here is that the path is like that, right? In other words, if you practice the path, it's like the water it's like purifying the water, so it becomes potable again, it becomes pure again. And that everybody has this Dharmakaya, and its nature is that it's never changed, it's always pure. It's always, what's the word? No matter how many afflictions it's mixed with, or mixed over it, or put over it, or whatever, they never stain it. So it remains unstained. And therefore it can be, through the practice of the path, it could become the Dharmakaya, the Buddha, the mind of a Buddha. So then if we go back, each of these points, these three, the jewel, space, and water, has a referent. So they say the jewel is a reference to the Dharmakaya itself, to the resultant state. And why? Because they usually say wish-fulfilling jewel, which is a kind of mythical jewel in Indian culture. But the idea here is this, is that a jewel can fulfill the wishes of beings, right? Like, as a jewel is valuable, yes, you could, it's worth a lot of money, so essentially is what they're saying. So, if you have a jewel, you can fulfill, and if you have a wish fulfilling jewel, they say you can fulfill beings' wishes, particularly. That's kind of like the philosopher's stone or something like that. European culture, similar, it's comparable sort of story or thing, I guess. So if you had the philosopher's stone, or whatever, then you can fulfill beings' wishes, is the idea. And so the Dharmakaya is like that, right? As you were getting at, the Dharmakaya can manifest things that help beings by teaching them the path and helping them progress and helping them be liberated. And so therefore they're using that, the jewel as a symbol of, or a reminder of the Dharmakaya. Then space, right, is a reminder, of emptiness itself. Because space is a mere negation of obstruction, and emptiness is a mere negation of intrinsic existence. So they're similar. And they sometimes say in certain texts, they'll say, space is the best or the only, sometimes they'll say, metaphor for emptiness. And they'll say, and it's not really a good metaphor for emptiness, but it's because it's a negation, and it's open, and it's sort of not, it's a negation of obstruction. They say it's the best thing we can use to kind of get at what's emptiness like, and they say, but it's not really a good metaphor because it's not a negation of intrinsic existence. We grasp at the inherent existence of space also, and
We try to imagine space.
yeah, exactly. And so, but it's a stand-in for emptiness. So that's what space is used for. And then water is a referent to the lineage or the Buddha potential within us. And they say, in this last verse that I read, it says, water, because there's a traditional metaphor, I guess, that water, it says moistened with compassion, right? That water is, because I guess they get at that in the sense that, like, water softens things. If you have like hard earth and you put water on it, it gets softer, right? It's not like so hard. And that's a metaphor in a way for our hearts, right? Like, that compassion softens our hearts, and our hearts get more, we actually say that, don't we? Like he or she hardened, we usually say he hardened his heart. It's sort of like Shakespeare. So water is a kind of something that softens, and so in that sense, moistened, and also some of the tears, right, or like tears of compassion. So it's a metaphor for, water can be a kind of metaphor for compassion in Buddhist practice. Actually, when you offer water bowls, that's what sometimes the symbolism is. You think, the Buddhists don't mean water, but it's a reminder of compassion, actually. So it's a good way to think if you're going to offer water bowls on your altar. It's a good way to think of it. It's not, the Buddhists don't need water, but it's a symbol of my compassion for all beings. So water, though, is a reference to our potential, and also that compassion. And I guess I'll make 2 points, though, if you think about it. One is, the compassion of the Buddhas helps us develop that, helps us awaken that potential, but also our own practice of compassion is what really causes that potential, our Buddha potential, to start to. So when actually, that's the main way that you awaken your own Buddha potential, isn't it? At the beginning. Eventually, it's through realizing the ultimate nature of reality. But as a Chandrakirti, in his Entering the Middle Way, he starts at the very beginning, he says, compassion is important in the beginning, compassion is important in the middle, compassion is important in the end. And he says it's important in the beginning because it's how you start on the path. It's important in the middle because it's how bodhisattvas progress on the path. It's important in the end because it's the main activity of the Buddhas. He says, so there's no time at which compassion is not important. And actually, it's very touching in that text. It's a text on the view, ultimately. It's most of the pages of it are on emptiness. And usually Buddhist texts, traditional Indian Buddhist texts, begin with an homage, like homage to Maitreya, or homage to the Buddha, or homage to and he says homage to compassion right before he says that line about it's important in the beginning, the middle, and the end. He says, I pay homage to compassion. And then he says, and he makes a point in a way, which is, sometimes people make homage to the Buddha, and then he says, but actually compassion is the cause of the Buddha. So if I make compassion to the Buddha, it serves, the same function. Or they can pay homage to the Bodhisattvas, and then he says, but compassion is the cause of the Bodhisattvas, right? So it serves the same function. So it's very beautiful. So anyway, it's compassion that helps us awaken our own Buddha nature. So, but you get the main point here. So when you think about the nature of the Tathagata here, what is mainly getting at, these three metaphors or similes rather, are getting at a point, which is, although it can be hard to see because it's can be mixed with mental afflictions and covered over by them, better way to put it, in its nature is always pure. And so if you're trying to understand your own Buddha nature, that's one point to contemplate. Right? Its nature is pure. And this time I want to cover one more point because they go together in the text here. So it next says cause. And first it says, it arises through devotion to the Dharma, supreme wisdom, samadhi, and compassion. Then it goes on. I'm going to continue on cause, because it further explains those. Devotion to the Dharma, supreme wisdom, samadhi, and compassion. And now it explains them. And it explains them in an interesting way that I just think is worth contemplating. So we'll cover this and then we'll stop today. So it's saying, in terms of cause, it says the kinds of persons with obstructions, and obstructions, so in other words, what this is getting at in a way is, there are certain things that obscure us from accessing our Buddha nature. And then they have antidotes that allow us to overcome those obstacles in order to activate and access our Buddha nature. And so in cause, that's what it's getting at, right? Is there are causes that ordinary people have that get in the way of manifesting their potential. And then there are antidotes to those that allow us to. And it's good to understand the antidote to each obstacle so that you can apply it. That's the idea here. So the first obstruction that block us from developing, from having our Buddha potential develop is, it says here, actually the way they said animosity towards the Mahayana Dharma. I think it's actually should be just, really the Mahayana is in brackets, it should say animosity to the Dharma. That's the actually what Maitreya says. So what does that mean? It's just like, and there are many examples of that, aren't there? But well, actually, I'll go. I don't want to. There's more on this later, so I don't want to jump to. I don't want to cover things that are covered later in the text. So I'm going to be careful a little bit. Oh, under result, it covers certain things. So I'm going to be. I won't say. There's going to be more on this next time. So I'm trying to not explain things that are explained later in the text. So I was pausing for a second. I guess I'll just say it simply, right? There's animosity towards the Dharma that's like, actually, if Dharma is what allows one to develop compassion, love, and also seek the nature of reality, actually, there are limitless versions of animosity to that, aren't there? And we know that. Like, in other words, that's not hard to figure out, right? Like, it's just feeling like that's irrelevant, right? Like, in other words, feeling, you could actually, so animosity, I guess my point is animosity towards Dharma could be, you could think of the extreme example of, say, indoctrinated people who are in the communist army of China who are trying to destroy Buddhist monastery, literally going and killing monks and nuns and burning down monasteries and destroying texts and something. And that's one example of animosity of Dharma. But actually, animosity towards the Dharma in this context can also just mean like like most people, you know. You know, like, you know, who would just say like, I mean, I'm not, you know, I don't know. I mean, you have to know the actual person, but like, you know, people would just say like, I don't care about that. Like, in other words, like, you know, I don't care about cultivating love. I want to go party. Like, or I want to go be more powerful than the next person, or I want to go make more money than that guy, or him or her, you know, whatever. Whatever it might be. I mean, there are countless examples of animosity towards Dharma where you just don't care about, you know, like, and again, animosity towards Dharma doesn't just mean Buddhism in this context. I don't think, you know, if you were to say, you know, there's great value in cultivating love for all beings, and somebody would say, that's just stupid. Like, you know, like, that's idiotic. You know, what matters is protecting my family and making a big legacy or something, you know. Yeah, I'm just giving whatever, the countless examples. But if you have any of those kinds of animosity towards developing, you know, and of course, and one way of putting it is, in this context, if you think of if you think of Dharma as the essence of Dharma is compassion and is seeking the nature of reality. If you have animosity towards those pursuits, then you're not going to awaken your Buddha nature. How could you, right? Because the nature, you know, Buddha nature means developing an awareness of the ultimate nature of reality and developing love and compassion. So if you have an animosity towards doing that, you're not going to awaken your Buddha nature by definition. And so how do you, I'm going to jump up and down here to cover each one. So how do you overcome that? And it says here, those who have the seed of devotion to the Mahayana Dharma. So it means that you have faith. They sometimes say faith or devotion. There are different translations of this term. But what they're getting at is, you know, if you have a wish to deeply pursue, right? In other words, the opposite of animosity to the Dharma, or the antidote to that, is deeply wishing to pursue your awakening, the awakening of compassion, the awakening to the nature of reality. And when you have that deep devotion to pursuing that, then you've overcome your animosity towards the Dharma. And a deep wish to pursue that is required if you're going to awaken your Buddha nature, because, well, it's kind of obvious, isn't it? How are you going to, if you don't have a deep wish and desire, there are going to be many factors that can distract you from awakening your capacity for wisdom and your capacity for love. And if you don't have a strong, I mean, devotion seems, sometimes, I don't know, like faith or devotion. I mean, those are reasonable terms, but it's like conviction, maybe something like that, you know, I don't know, commitment. Yeah, something like that. Commitment, conviction, devotion. I mean, devotion in the sense of like, you say I'm devoting myself to a cause or my career, you know, in this case, I'm devoting myself to awakening, to path or something. So anyway, whatever term you want to use, but you get the idea, right? So the obstacle that's a cause of not accessing your Buddha nature is this animosity towards the Dharma, and then that kind of conviction and faith and devotion and aspiration, you know, there are different terms, but anyway, that's the antidote to that. The second obstacle to accessing the Dharma, accessing the Tathagata is listed here as view of a self, which we started with today, right? I. And the antidote to that one is, the line says, it's the Dharma whose mother is wisdom that gives birth to the Buddha's truth body. So the idea here is, you know, to really access our Buddha nature, which is ultimately the empty nature of mind, of your own mind itself. If you're grasping at a view of an inherently existent self, that stops you from accessing an understanding of the nature of your own mind, right? So in other words, if you're grasping at what's the word, independently existent or self-existent, or there are different terms here, independently existent self or self-existent self or intrinsically existent self, inherently existent self. There are different, on a grosser level, it's the self-sufficient, substantially existent self. on a more subtle level, it's the intrinsically existent self, but here it just says view of self, right? So the idea is so long as we're grasping at that, we won't access the Dharmakaya, which is the empty, we won't be able to see the empty nature of our own mind. And they make a point here in the commentaries that, sometimes you can understand this view of self as somebody who has a kind of philosophical position, asserting some kind of ultimate self, like Atman, or, there are all different philosophical schools, but more generally, you don't have to assert some philosophical thing. You could just be grasping at a self, there's the acquired views of a self, which are like kind of philosophical assertions about an ultimate self, but there's also the innate grasping at a self, which we share with animals, for example. And as long as you have that, it blocks you from seeing the ultimate nature of yourself and your mind. So that's an obstacle. And the way to overcome that, as I mentioned, the verse is the mother is the wisdom that gives birth to the Dharmakaya, the truth body of Buddha. So wisdom, oftentimes, in general, in Buddhism, first of all, the masculine is often associated with method, and then wisdom. Wisdom is usually associated with the feminine, and oftentimes wisdom is called the mother, right? So the Prajnaparamita is called the mother of the Buddhas, for example, and she's often depicted. Prajnaparamita is not a person, of course, in the end, but is depicted as a female form. There's a beautiful artwork depicting the Prajnaparamita as a kind of goddess. Because it's in Vajrayana Buddhism, where they have the male and female, that's the symbolism usually. They sometimes have these images, like Guhya Samaja there, the name of the center is a male and female in union, but it's a symbol of method and wisdom together. And that the practice of Dharma is a combination of method and wisdom. And at one point they make in the commentary here is that one reason why they call it mother also is that one is it's what gives rise, and one is literally it's from that wisdom that the Buddha arises. So in a sense, she gives birth to the Buddha. That's one, right? That it's from the realization, emptiness, that the Buddha arises as a Buddha. So literally, you could say like the Buddha arises from that. So you say it's like a mother in that sense. Sometimes they also make a point where they say, that depending on the method, that wisdom can give rise to different kinds of children. In other words, if you have bodhicitta, and then you have that wisdom, then that wisdom gives birth to a Buddha. But it's the same wisdom that gives birth to say, somebody who achieves arhatship, right? Like they have the same wisdom understanding emptiness, but their method is just wishing for their own liberation, not wishing for the liberation of all beings. So when they arise from such meditative equipoise on wisdom, they achieve only their own liberation. That's an example, right? So their method is different, but the wisdom is the same. So they would sort of say, well, it's like metaphors that they have different fathers, different, so they have a kind of different, what's the word, a different father, therefore they have a different kind of appearance, but still their mother was the same wisdom in that sense, metaphorically speaking. So it's a metaphor for that. But you get the idea. So a view of self, you see how it would block you from realizing your Buddha nature, and it's wisdom that overcomes that. And they say, I'll cover that last two. So then the third one is the fear of the sufferings of samsara. And you can see in the last line here, that applies to hearers, which means like Shravakas. So it's actually Buddhist practitioners, right, who are trying to achieve their own liberation. They're not trying to achieve Buddhahood. And they say the reason why some practitioners do that, right? On the one hand, they're practitioners. They're practicing Buddhism and they'll achieve liberation. That's good. But they have this fear of samsara, right? That's so strong that they're afraid to engage compassionately for the welfare of others because they feel, well, others are, if I say they have compassion, but they feel samsara is so unbearable, right? Which is true, by the way. that if I engage too much with others, I'll get caught up in all that mess. And let me just get out of here. Let me get some kind of liberation, is the idea that they feel. And the problem, of course, is that on one hand, they achieve liberation, so it's a good thing, but on the other hand, they don't achieve Buddhahood, and they don't engage with others compassionately as a Buddha would. And so here it's kind of, I mean,
I was just gonna say, don't they have to, once they've achieved liberation, do they go to a pure land? They have to, they have to achieve Buddhahood. Just in the short term, it's only about kind of their liberation, but they still have to learn the.
yeah, that's right. Yeah. I mean, there are different, actually, again, there are different philosophical positions on that. Like some Buddhist philosophers in India, actually, some Indian Buddhist philosophers asserted that arhats don't go on to Buddhahood. But Majjhimaka, this text, which is Majjhimaka text, and Majjhimaka philosophers in general say they will eventually become Buddhas. So they say that they achieve a kind of mental body that abides for a long stretch of time, and then eventually the Buddhas awaken them and say, now you have to practice compassion. And the antidote to that fear of suffering, the fear that they're so afraid of suffering they can't get themselves to engage with others. In the text here, it says, the antidote to that is the womb of blissful concentration. And it's an interesting metaphor here, because what the commentary says, if one develops the concentrations of a bodhisattva, that they're like a womb in the sense that they're a safe context in which you can develop. Like, so it's meditative content. The point they're getting at here is that when beings are afraid of the suffering of samsara, having the experience that actually, if you develop shamatha, right, calm abiding, call it in English, I guess. It's a calm abiding. It's the right term. Shine in Tibetan. There's a blissful quality to that, and your mental afflictions are suppressed. Actually, when you develop calm abiding, they're not yet it takes wisdom to cause cessation of them, but they're suppressed, and you have a kind of blissful experience of meditative concentration. And that blissful experience of meditative concentration is like a womb, here it says, in the sense that it's like, actually you could say it that way, like that sometimes it's hard, right? They're seeing the suffering of the world. And that part of the idea here is for bodhisattvas is they do see the suffering. They engage with it. And they're able to kind of, though, have these meditative experiences of concentration that restore them, that give them, that allow them to engage, to re-engage. And I often think of Tara, this she has this posture where her left leg, if you see in the tanka there, her left leg is in and her right leg is out. And the symbolism, the meaning behind that symbol is the in is meditative concentration, right? She's in the posture of meditation. So her left leg is in that posture, like the Buddha is when he's, like a meditative pose, right? So she has this experience of blissful concentration, and at the same time, her right leg is out, which symbolizes that she's ready to get up and go help. She's out in the world. So I think, to me, I often think of her as embodying this quality of compassionate engagement combined with this inner peace that comes through meditation, so that then her activity in the world is not separate from peace, if that makes sense, from a peaceful state, from a kind of inner peace. So she's able to engage in compassionate activity while sustaining an inner peace. And that's what bodhisattvas are able to do through this experience of concentration that they develop. Yeah.
This reminds me of there's a movie called Never Look Away. Like it's an artist Richter. It's his story. He grew up in Nazi Germany and then he eventually came to the West after Berlin was divided. But he didn't really develop into the artist he became until he looked back on his experience in under Nazi Germany, and the name of the movie is Never Look Away. And it was only by going back to that experience and seeing it, did he really come into his own as an artist?
Hmm.
Which is pretty much what you're saying.
That's beautiful. Hmm. Oh, and John has his hand up. John, yeah, you can go ahead.
So I think this will have to wait till next time because I know it's 12:30, but I was really struck, just briefly to introduce it. I was really struck when I read the order of those 4 causes that purify the defilements, devotion to the Mahayana, and then wisdom, and then, deep meditation, and then compassion. And I think, at least the way I've studied in past years, is that the customary order, like for example in the 6 perfections, is shamatha and then vipassana. That vipassana is on the platform of shamatha. But here, and I was thinking it must not be a mistake, that Maitreya made to put wisdom before deep meditation, before concentration.
Hmm.
So I can bring it up next time unless you want to indulge it now, but just, the way that that led my thinking.
I'll say something very quick about it, and I know we should stop in a minute, but I'll say something very quick about it because I'll say something quickly and then we'll finish up. Because I'll put it in context of the 4th point is right, a lack of concern for the welfare of all sentient beings, and the solution to that one is the nurse of compassion, right? So it's developing compassion. In other words, as we develop compassion, we overcome a lack of concern for the welfare of others, right? That's the 4th obstacle, because you need compassion to develop your bodhicitta, and a lack of being essentially not caring so much about others is an obstacle to bodhicitta. That's connected. So, John, to your question, which is, I didn't actually read it, or I did read it aloud initially, maybe, but I didn't focus on it, is what this is getting at is that there are 4 main kinds of people who these overcome, if that makes sense. And by the way, like, say it the right way, like, to some extent, these 4 are not separate from us. We shouldn't think, oh, these are 4 kinds of people, like, oh, those bad people. 4 kinds of people means us at certain moments, or maybe all the time or something. But and it lists them here in the text where it says, so this is why they're presented in this order, I think, is it's from lower to higher, in a way, of kinds of kinds of problems you have, right? Obstacles. In other words, so the first is those with great desire for samsara. So if you're somebody who has great desire for samsara, then by definition, you have animosity towards the Dharma. You don't care about it, right? What you're interested in is power, or Jan was saying at the beginning today, we were chatting, the 8 worldly concerns. If all you're concerned with is your own pleasure, your own status, your own reputation, then you have great desire for those things and you don't care about the Dharma. So you have animosity towards it. And the solution to that is devotion. In this text, they say. That's the lower of the 4 kind of beings. You don't even have an interest. Then there are those who develop an interest in practicing spirituality, right? They are interested. And here it mentions Tirthakas, Tirthakas, which are like, according to, this is like a term from Sanskrit for like non-Buddhist philosophers will wrong understanding, the wrong philosophical positions. But it's broader than that. In the commentary, Asanga makes a point. It's broader than that. It's anybody who's holding to a view of a self. And if you're holding to that, then, so it could be like somebody who is, what's the word? Has an interest in spirituality, but it's a wrong kind of, it's a wrong-headed path or something. It's a path that's not going to lead somewhere good. So that's why they talk about view of self there. And the solution to that is wisdom. And that's sort of getting on the right path in a way. So here it's presented that way, like that the first is not even interested in the path. The second is the wisdom to get on the right path. The third obstacle are hearers, right? So somebody who is on a path, and it's a correct path in the sense of wisdom, but they they're mainly concerned for themselves, right? It's a third kind of, so this is like a higher, you can think of them from the lower to higher kinds of practitioners that are still not able to access their Buddha nature. So this hearer person, the hearer is somebody who's on a correct path to liberation, but they're not going to access their Buddha nature because they're still overly self-concerned, right? So for them, concentration is what will help them, particularly concentrations of a bodhisattva. And then the last are Pratyeka Buddhas, right? Self-arisen, it says here in the text. It means a Pratyeka Buddha, who are higher actually than the Shravakas. They're quite good practitioners, but they don't develop bodhicitta because they also have this lack of compassion, right? A lack of, they actually have compassion. What they lack is great compassion. They don't have the kind of great compassion of a bodhisattva. And so they need to develop compassion to overcome it. So on the one hand, we all have those obstacles, but it's mentioning particularly 4 kinds of practitioners. So that's why the 4 obstacles and the 4 antidotes are presented in that order in this text. That's not a complete answer to your question, but I want to at least briefly answer. So if you look at it from the 4 kinds of people who have these 4 kinds of obstacles that the 4 kinds of antidotes overcome, that's the reason for the order in this text, which is different than the reason for the order in, like, say, a Lamrim text or state or other texts.
Yeah, yeah, I like that analysis very much. I had a different take on it. I can hold it till next time, though.
Yeah, I think we have, do we have class? I think we have class next week, right? Yeah, yeah, so let's start with it next week then.
Mhm.
Yeah, so maybe we can pause at the beginning and do a question.
Okay.
See, I know we went over, but okay, so we should do the dedication. So supreme jewel bodhicitta, where it has not arisen, may it arise and grow. Where it has arisen, may it not decrease, but increase more and more. In the snowy mountain paradise, you, the source of good and happiness, all powerful Chenrezig Tenzin Gyatso, please remain until samsara ends. I dedicate all these merits, which are merely labeled, totally empty from their own side, so that the I, which is merely labeled, totally empty from its own side, may achieve Buddha's enlightenment, which is merely labeled, totally empty from its own side, in order to lead all sentient beings who are merely labeled, totally empty from their own side, to the state of enlightenment as quickly as possible. And in particular, may we all, studying together, be able to actualize or develop or realize our Tathagata Garbha. And maybe we be able, as we just covered it, maybe we have, through this effort, may we become able to overcome the 4 kinds of obstacles to actualizing and developing our Buddha potential. And may we fully actualize those 4 types of antidotes, right? Like great compassion, wisdom, devotion, and so on. So through this effort, may we be able to be like that in order to be of greatest possible benefit to ourselves and to others. And thanks, everybody. See you next week.
Thanks, Lauren.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Oh, thanks.
Thanks, Lauren.
Thanks. Good to see everybody.
Yeah, good to see everyone.
Thank you.